everybody, and welcome to 2026, the first Lucky Paper Radio of the new year. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, digging ginseng all over the land, Maddox.
I don't know how to respond to this. I'm sorry.
Do you get the reference?
Of course. I mean, I just did a...
Right, okay.
What was it? Endless Whispers.
Endless Whispers. It was Nighttime Whispers is the actual lyric.
Nighttime Whispers. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, you're, of course, referring to the classic 2006...
I don't know when did it come out? We saw it in college, but I don't know if that's when it came out or not.
About people that get scammed, actually, is what it's about now that I think about it. That's sad.
It's amazing how much that documentary has stuck with me. I will look up the name of it. It's something, the title was something, and then the subtitle is the song poem story or something, song poems. But it's about this whole market, this industry in music magazines before the internet, where you could basically send in your poem or whatever and pay $50 or some amount of money, and they would send you back a vinyl record or a CD with your poem turned into a song and performed for you. And you say it was a scam because I think at some point there was like some promise of maybe this will kickstart your music career if, your all-time great single gets recorded. But I think in actuality, like, for how it was priced, I think it's kind of fair.
It's kind of a high-effort scam. Like, they actually had studio musicians that would, like, come into the studio and just record a bunch of song poems, like, back to back to back to back. And I think that, a lot of times it was sold as, like, maybe this will hit the top of the charts and you'll get super big, but, like, we need you to fund the initial, like, get that initial injection of capital. That part was the scammy part, but, like...
But now it's like compared to like Fiverr or whatever, like you got a song made for you and then delivered on a physical media for
the scams have just gotten so much scammier. Now it's like write down how much money you're giving or like, I don't know, all the crypto scams are just so f***ing stupid. And it's like, what's even?
Yeah, scams now are just like, quick, what are your bank account numbers? it's much less interesting. But it's a really low budget documentary that got very little circulation, but it has really stuck with me for 20 years or however long ago.
Same.
I watched that stupid documentary. I play the little songs in my head all the time, and it's fascinating. Like, they talk to the studio musicians that it's like this guy has studio musicians playing like kind of default, backing like G major jazz beds or whatever, and he just picks up a like printed out page of paper he has never read before and then sings it as a song and then moves on to the next one. Like, one take. We are not spending any time to like read this ahead of time or make any kind of plan. We're just going to make a song off the rip. And digging ginseng. Jimmy Carter says yes.
Nighttime Whispers is the one that really is lodged deep in my brain. Anytime I hear something that has that same cadence to it, the same meter, it's there. The things that stick with you. We can't choose them. Unlike modal mechanics.
Wow, you're so much better at this than me. You should host every episode. We're back on Modal Mechanics Part 3. Part 1, it was like 7 months between Part 1 and Part 2, and then it was like 3 weeks between Part 2 and Part 3, because it's the holidays, and we're backing up some recordings, and we need a topic. So we're back to Modal Mechanics Part 3. I'm really enjoying this little series. I think it's fun to look back at these mechanics, and a lot of them, I think especially in our last episode, and maybe in this episode, are mechanics that have not been returned to, or not like well-known mechanics, but I think do offer some interesting space for cube designers to potentially play in. So
it's also been fun just sort of like going back and looking through old sets and looking at what all the sort of headline mechanics were for them. It's funny, there's some gaps where I'm just like, there's got to be like more modal mechanics between 2008 and 2012. Because like every mechanic has some kind of modality to it. But turns out, no, there's just like a couple different structures. And I wonder if it might be interesting at some point in the future to use this retrospective as a way to think about like classifying the types of mechanics in the game. Because I've heard so many people say like, there's only really two mechanics. There's split cards and there's kicker. And everything is kind of some sort of spin or extension on that.
I've heard so many people say that and then say two different mechanics.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I've heard mostly those two, but I feel like that's kind of not true. Like I feel like kicker and split cards actually have a lot more in common than, say, like static abilities that are like state changes that are global or other types of effects. So it'd be fun to kind of break that down. But also, that might just be me being a computer programmer and wanting to categorize and quantify and break everything down into its sort of rigid structure.
For sure. Should we dive in where we left off?
Let's do it. So we ended on Reinforce in Morningtide, correct?
That's what I remember ending on. And I think we're going to start with some pedantry because the first mechanic you have listed here is Scavenge.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a modal mechanic, but I think it's interesting to talk about through this lens. So the idea is we're talking about mechanics that give players choice. Like here's a card that says you can do A or B. Scavenge isn't really that. It's you have a creature, and when it dies, you can use its scavenge ability to then exile it from your graveyard for a cost and put counters equal to its power on another creature.
The Scavenge card that is most well known to everyone in our playgroup and you is Bannerhide Cruciak, which is modal because it also has Reinforce. But I think the Reinforce is the modal part.
Right, this is actually perfect. We could just keep talking about Bannerhide Cruciak.
Bannerhide
Cruciak mechanics here.
The bridge Bannerhide Cruciak that just goes between mechanics. I actually don't think Scavenge cards are mechanic at all, or modal at all, which, I mean, there was a lot of pedantic commentary on the past episode as to what actually constituted a modal mechanic, and that's the idea. That's what we're doing here, so I guess continue that discourse. But you said a modal mechanic was something that offered a player choices. I think there's tons of mechanics that offer you choices that are not at all modal. Like, what do you want to target with this thing?
That's fair, yeah.
So to me, mode is like, it has to do two discretely different things. And I think for me, for it to be like really modal, you got to be able to also kind of control the order. Like if they just always happen in sequence, then a saga is a card that does multiple different things. Each of the sort of chapter abilities on a saga do different mechanical things. I would never call them modal cards because they happen in a pre-described order. And to me, all the Scavenge creatures are just basically like filigree familiars. They say, when I die, draw a card. And that card just happens to be pay X mana to put this May +1/+1 counters on a creature you control.
Sure, I think that's reasonable framing. I think that that's kind of a case where individual examples of card designs would kind of influence how much I think of it as a kind of modal card, because if it's something that's just like costed in a way that like, actually, I really want to find some other way to discard, or yeah, in the example of Bannerhide Cruciak, it has another mechanic that builds the discard into it, the self-discard into it, meaning you do have reasonable choice of like, do I just want to cast as a creature that when it dies kind of draws me this additional effect, or do I want to deliberately get it in the graveyard to get that second effect? And I think I agree just based on the way that the cards are costed. And I have to say, I cast a Dreg Mangler just this week, and it was fine. But I think I agree that there is like a certain degree of modality to effects that come out of the graveyard. But yeah, this one probably doesn't fit the baseline definition.
I mean, no disagreement from me that Bannerhide Cruciak absolutely rules. I will say, looking at every single card here with Scavenge, I think it's an underexplored space to have a card. You mentioned like a card you'd rather discard than cast. I don't think any of them fit that description.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe Slitherhead, which has Scavenge 0, but it just puts a +1/+1 counter, a single +1/+1 counter on a creature. But for all the other ones, with Sluice Waste Scorpion being the only exception, the Scavenge cost is the same as or greater than the mana cost. And so you're pretty much always going to want to play it as a creature first and then scavenge it away, which, to be fair, is kind of flavorful for the mechanic. Like, if you're scavenging away a creature that never was a creature in play and never died, it kind of defeats the purpose, but does seem like, you know, something that's ripe for more Modern Horizons design, some card that's like a reasonable, you know, like a 4-mana 4/4 that's vanilla, but then has Scavenge for like, you know, 2 mana, and it puts 4 +1/+1 counters on something. Then you actually actively want to discard it instead of cast it. That could be kind of cool, but that's just not what they do. To that end, I do want to just give a quick shout out here to Verol's The Scar Striped. This is a card that I have in my Dreadnought / Eater of Days / Leveler package in Take 5. And this card does turn a lot of other cards into funny modal cards because...
Yeah, and I think this might be what's influencing my perception of this mechanic a little bit, because that individual card, I mean, we've just seen it come up in a lot of different Commander games and Cube formats as well.
What Verol's does is give every creature card in your graveyard Scavenge with Scavenge equal to its mana cost. So any creature that has some other big downside that makes it hard to get into play or hard to cast, if its mana value is low and it has high power and toughness, the sort of iconic example of this is Death Shadow. Death Shadow is 1 mana for a 13/13. Now, if it's in play, it gets -X, where X is your life total, but if it's in your graveyard, it's just a 1 mana 13/13. And so you just pay 1 mana and you get to put 13 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control. A lot of cool options with Verol's The Scar Striped.
Okay, this next one, I don't think you'll disagree with me, though. Bloodrush, first printed, or maybe only printed, in Gatecrash.
No disagreement here. Clear modal mechanic, in my humble opinion.
So Bloodrush, like Scavenge, is a mechanic that's just on creatures. You've got your creature that does whatever you want to do. It's got keywords, it has attack triggers, but it also has discard for some mana cost, and target attacking creature gets +X/+X, and sometimes some other ability until end of turn. And interestingly, something that I really like about this mechanic is the boost that it's giving to your creature is, I think in all cases, identical to the power and toughness and keywords of the creature itself. So it just makes these cards pretty easy to read and understand.
Yeah, this is a clean, easy modal mechanic. Only 13 cards ever printed with this rules text. The most iconic ones, I think, are Gore Clan Rampager, which a great example here of a like pretty cheap Bloodrush cost for the actual upside. Ironically, actually, this is a 4 mana 4/4, which is what I suggested maybe they could do with Scavenge, that has Bloodrush for 2 mana, just a red and a green, discarded to give a creature +4/+4 and trample till end of turn. I like Pyrowild Shaman a lot. I think it's a really cool Bloodrush design that creature has a way to get it back from the graveyard. So if you want, you can just repeatedly use it as a combat trick, assuming you're willing to pay the cost associated with recurring it. And it's very cool that it can either be played as a creature and then recurred as a creature, or played as a combat trick and recurred as a combat trick, or played as a creature and then recurred as a combat trick after it dies. Like, you can kind of do all different funky things with it. Big Pyrowild Shaman fan here.
I do have one criticism of this, though, because I've definitely played a lot of these cards in cubes. Gorklan Rampager, you mentioned, is an all-time favorite of mine. I really don't love that it only affects attacking creatures, and I wonder if part of that was just like flavorful. They just want to, reinforce that the Groll clan here is all about just like attacking and getting in there. But when I see the cards in my hand, it's so easy for me to make the mistake, especially on Wasteland Viper, which gives a creature death touch. I just see this card and think, oh, this is a great like defensive play. I want to be blocking and giving my creatures death touch, and then you can't do that. And just like, especially having made that mistake a couple times and then revealing your cool combat trick that you now can't get value out of in the future is kind of a bummer. Assuming you're you couldn't accidentally do it and reveal information and then discard your thing because you don't have a valid target, so it goes back in your hand. That's how Magic rules work.
I'm 95% sure it's what a judge would have you do. We've talked about this with a couple other modal mechanics in our prior episodes, and it matters here too that this is an ability you can activate from your hand. It is not casting the spell with a different mode, which means that it is immune to counter spells, which is great. But it also means that certain things don't affect it. Like, I'm not sure if Daniel still does, but for a long time, Daniel had Gorklan Rampager in Reading Rainbow, which is the cube where you start with the Pillar of the Parents in play. And Pillar of the Parents allows you to make any color of mana to cast a gold spell only. But paying the Bloodrush for Gorklan Rampager is not casting a gold spell. It is activating an ability, and so you cannot use mana from Pillar of the Parents to do so. That sort of weird little edge case does come up sometimes. And honestly, I forgot until we looked at it just now that it was just attacking creatures. And yeah, it definitely really changes the texture of them. I imagine, honestly, you know what I really think it was? And we can maybe turn this into another sort of combat trick proxy war. I would have guessed that in development, maybe it was just really not that fun to have this many combat tricks in a specific color combination in a set. Yeah. Where it's like, okay, now I can never attack or block. And here at least it's like, well, I can never block. Like we're just cutting away half the ways in which combat tricks can blow you out. But we're not turning off all of your toughness-based removal. We're not turning off your blocks, or your attacks, rather. We are just making blocking much harder. Like, I suspect with 13 cards that, I guess Pyrowild Shaman, was that originally in that set? It wasn't Dragon's Maze, yeah. So with 13 cards in Dragon's Maze that all had essentially a combat trick mode on them, I wonder if that would just be really awful in that density in Limited.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. My initial thought was that it was purely a flavorful thing, and I think that that's always a cool opportunity when the mechanic can be adjusted in a way that sort of expresses the way you're going to use it. Like, because if I'm calling this Bloodrush and what I'm doing is I'm just sitting back and blocking and have great combat tricks that are going to be great on defense, that doesn't feel like Bloodrush, but it definitely could be both. I think that's a really interesting point.
Maybe I'll actually, if I think to do it, I will listen to, I'm sure that Mark Rosewater has recorded a Drive to Work episode about Dragon's Maze, where he talks about the mechanics, and he may mention offhand in that episode why it is designed this way. And I'll try and find that clip if I can.
The other thing that I actually really don't love about Bloodrush is I see this mechanic, and the first thing it makes me think is I want to put this into a cube where I want to be targeting my own creatures. I have things like Heroic, and I want to have ways to get more spells in addition to having a reasonable creature density that, makes sense for the kind of gameplay I'm going for. And then Bloodrush, like you said, it's an activated ability. It doesn't count as casting a spell, so it just doesn't trigger those things.
Yeah, that was actually the other one I was trying to think of and couldn't, so I'm so glad you mentioned it. But yeah, that is the other situation where it being an ability and not a spell has mattered. And I feel like you've actually cut Bloodrush cards from the regular cube because of that specific feel-bad moment where it's like, oh, I guess this doesn't actually trigger my heroic stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny, then they printed Valiant, which is like this twist on heroic, which does work with Bloodrush. So it's like this weird combination. But then I think it gets even worse if you're playing a cube where you have both heroic and valiant, and then some things that only trigger half of your things. It just like, I don't know. In some cases, that can be interesting texture when things don't quite overlap neatly, but I think in a lot of cases, it can just trip people up and be confusing and set people up for frustration. But I do think it's funny, Gorklan Rampager, I just like never feel as bothered by the attacking limitation because it makes the thing huge and gives it trample. Like, that is just such a card you expect to use in an aggressive way that it feels a lot more natural to me.
I'm sure people are going to mention this in the comments, but just to say it now that I've realized it, this was not actually in just one set. It was split across Gatecrash and Dragon's Maze. So that makes my potential explanation of too many Bloodrush creatures in the same set seem less likely to me. Yeah, so just Pyrowild Shaman and Rubber Belt Maka in Dragon's Maze, and then the rest were in Gatecrash, and mostly a Gatecrash mechanic. So you're looking at 11 cards in the Gruul color identity in Gatecrash. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them common. That's a lot.
It is a lot. I mean, it's also, I think that very often if we see like Adventure kind of had this similar situation of, in a limited set, them using that as a way to boost the number of instant sorceries and, number of ways to target your creatures, things like that. But I think a lot of, especially at Common, those combat tricks didn't give toughness, which I think meant that there weren't the same kind of blowouts. It's like, cool, I'm using my trick to trade rather than just like lose my creature, but it's not like, using combat tricks to always profitably block. And because they sort of priced themselves into this limitation of matching the boost with the power and toughness, they didn't have that flexibility. So I don't know, it's interesting to think about those design details and the kinds of things that they were testing and like that, like compromise between, do we want to do this thing that improves the ergonomics of this mechanic a little bit at the cost of giving us a little bit less flexibility in terms of card design? There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I do think that the toughness base removal would be the thing that would really suffer if you just had a ton of these floating around. I think the way in which it would suffer, to be clear, is that it may become a situation where the ideal play pattern is for neither player to ever be the first one to blink, right? Like,
right, yeah.
I'm never supposed to use any of my Bloodrush creatures because you might have toughest base removal, and you're never supposed to use any of your toughest base removal because I might have Bloodrush creatures, and then it becomes this game of chicken that tends to not be that fun. So I'm going to see if I can find, in the Gatecrash, not the Dragon's Mage, in the Gatecrash episode of Drive to Work, something about this mechanic. But overall, I think it's a cool mechanic. Honestly, the non-bow with Heroic is maybe one of the biggest downsides from a cube design perspective, because there's so many cool Heroic cards, and this is naturally exactly what you want to combine it with, and yet you can't really. And, we'll get to it probably in like 5 more episodes, but I think like the adventure creatures that have a combat trick on one side do that so much better because they do trigger your Heroic stuff. Ultimately, like, I do think Adventures is a less elegant mechanic than Bloodrush. Like, Bloodrush has got a lot of resonance to it.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, both Heroic and, things like your Young Pyromancer and your Murmuring Mystic, which maybe it's just me that ends up putting those in cubes all the time, but I feel like I see them a lot.
It's not just you. They're everywhere.
Next up is a weird one, because we've sort of talked a little bit about or alluded to every mechanic being kicker or a split card. Fuse kind of makes cards both. Fuse is just a tweak on a split card that allows you to, in addition to casting either side, you can cast both sides at the same time, get all the effects for the combined mana cost.
What do you think of Fuse, Anthony?
I don't know. I'm just like looking through all the cards and trying to think of like what are the ones that we actually see very often. I think Wear and Tear is the one that I see the most often.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's kind of a nice incremental balance where like it's a pretty unique situation where you actually have both an artifact and an enchantment in play that you care about, but is like a great payoff to be able to remove 2 targets at once when you can. I feel like more often it's just doing one or the other. And I think that kind of makes it a nice balance. Honestly, a lot of the other cards I don't see that often in any kind of cubes, and I wonder if it's just a little bit of a limited design space, because the power of actually being able to choose between combining 2 spells into one, like generating in this very literal way a certain kind of card advantage, 2 tiny cards, you get both the tiny cards, is maybe a little bit difficult to balance and limited the kinds of cards that could be built with it.
I don't think it's difficult to balance in the sense that they like couldn't figure out what the right mana cost could be. I think the reality is just that they end up looking really unappealing, because to be balanced properly, they have to cost quite a bit more than you generally want to pay for half of the effect. And so, I'm looking at Far and Away, which is a cool card that I could be excited about in a world. Far is 1 and a blue to return target creature to its owner's hand at instant speed, and Away is 2 and a black, target player sacrifices a creature. But a 2 mana unsummon is double what an unsummon normally costs, and Away is 50% more than an Edict usually costs. This is probably one of the most appealing ones, and yet still it's like, okay, at 5 mana I can it's pretty good, like bounce a thing, make you sacrifice another thing, but I think overall it ends up just looking kind of mopey. And you know what, honestly I think it might be a big factor here is that regular split cards came before the Fuse cards, and the regular split cards don't look mopey. Like, the individual sides can look good because, like you said, they don't have that additional mode of being able to literally get 2 cards out of 1 card. Like, if Fire Ice had Fuse, it would be absolutely cracked, because Fire Ice is already very good when it doesn't have Fuse. None of these cards without Fuse would be even remotely playable, and so it's kind of like, do you want the modality of having either spell, or like really you got to be paying the Fuse cost to get a like efficient effect out of it, I think is what it comes down to.
Right, yeah. It's like on a normal modal spell that just said, like, here's like 3 different options. It's going to be slightly overcosted because you get the benefit of flexibility.
Right.
But it's still like the mana cost is kind of close-ish to what you want to pay, just like a bit more. Here, because it has that built-in option that you can just get all of it, and it is that combination of mana cost. Like, they don't have the flexibility to do the thing like thinking about flashback spells. They can just make Chainer's Edict and give it flashback and just make it super expensive to flashback. Like, there's that knob they can turn to still make the first half pretty reasonable. Because the other way that they could do flashback is like put that extra expense kind of half and half, like spread it out. And they often will just make the front half still pretty efficient, still close to what you'd want, but then make that flashback cost expensive.
Which is more fun, honestly, than Chainer's Edict being 4 mana to cast and 4 mana to flashback or whatever.
But here, they've, again, it's interesting where they've kind of like made this mechanic that works in a very easy to grok way. It's just like, yeah, you want both, you just pay both costs. Like, I don't think you could do it in a way that would be like the next cleanest option would be pretty clunky. But yeah, it does price them into then having to tune the costs in a different way. The thing that I do really like is, as opposed to a normal split card, which is just 2 different things. Like, you're only doing one of them. You're only doing fire, you're only doing ice, so the parts don't necessarily need to relate to each other. Often they kind of relate to each other in more of an aesthetic way, like life, death, fire, ice. Like, that's kind of cool to have that sort of aesthetic difference on the cards. It is kind of a cool space that the fuse split cards, they kind of want to be doing almost similar things or have some overlap, mechanical interaction. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, you also resolve this in left to right order. So they can put some effect that does something, like on Beck, whenever you get a creature, you draw cards, call, make 4 tokens. So unless I'm an idiot, you cast Beck and call, you make 4 creatures, and also draw those 4 cards.
There's no way that you'd be an idiot if that's not how that works.
It would be crazy.
Wizards of the Coast would be idiots if that's not how that works. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the rules, but looking at them, I have to imagine they're resolved left to right, because that would be, you know, the reading direction of the English language, and also mechanically makes sense for so many of these, including Far and Away, right?
Yeah.
Like Far, you can bounce the thing that is their worst creature to make them sacrifice their better creature, you know? It's actually really interesting. I feel like these mechanics, Fuse especially, it kind of smacks of like a particular type of old Magic design where it feels like sacrifices were made for the aesthetics of the mechanic, right? Like, it is so cool that you just pay one cost or the other cost or both costs together. And they would have had so many more development knobs if they just made the Fuse a third cost, right? Like, if you want both, you pay for both of these, right? Which they could have theoretically done. And I feel like maybe modern R&D would do that. They would look at this mechanic and say, gosh, you know, it's actually really hard to make individually compelling cards in this otherwise elegant framework or like template we've created for ourselves. Instead, we are just going to make sacrifices for the like elegance of the template to like result in quote unquote better game pieces. I think it's just an interesting tension that I feel like I'm detecting in a lot of these cards as we go through these older modal mechanics. Does that make sense at all, or do you think that's made up?
No, I think totally. And I think we've seen more contemporary mechanics where they are just like, we just need design space. Like, make it as flexible as possible, put as many knobs on it as possible so that we can make a bunch of cards. And
maybe the cards are better balanced, right? Like, I'm sure, like, I trust that modern Magic R&D is in almost every way better than old Magic R&D. They have more resources. They put more time into the card designs.
They have a lot more experience.
But maybe there's like a degree to which the elegance is being sacrificed and there is like a hard to quantify cost there, right? Like, it's very easy to say, well, if we do this, we can really only make a dozen cards that like make any sense, or if we do it this way, we can make 50 cards that make sense, right? It's very easy to say if we template this mechanic in a slightly different way, we get this very material sort of measurable benefit. And it's much harder, I think, to argue the other side of that, which is just that this side just like is cleaner, it resonates more. And I feel like something I do a lot as a cube designer is like try and plumb the depths of Magic's history for the sort of rare times where like the cleanliness of a mechanical template and the like actual resulting card overlapped. And that might mean that, yeah, most of these Fuse cards are no good, but I just keep looking at Far and Away here and thinking like, this could be a very cool card actually for a lower powered cube. And maybe I will sneak it in somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think the another example that it's kind of interesting to me is Turn and Burn, because the burn side is just 2 mana, instant, deal 2 damage to target creature or player. So that is exactly fire, right? Or does fire split?
Fire can be split.
Right. There's too many Magic cards. Sorry. So it's just a cheap removal spell that kills a small creature on one side, or if you can also cast Turn, it shrinks it. So it's like, okay, this can be a kill spell for 5 mana, or for 3 mana, it can be a combat trick, or for 2 mana, it's a burn spell. It's like, I think that is kind of an interesting balance, but I don't know if the juice is quite worth the squeeze, because I think you're right that players are just going to overlook that. And I guess the other funny point is, like, they've turned the split card into a kicker card by saying it's a burn spell that now can be a straight up kill spell for 5 mana.
They've also turned split cards, which are, in my head, like hybrid, into gold cards effectively, because you don't want to play this in a deck that can only cast one side of any of these. Because of the aforementioned reasons, the rate is going to be quite low. Like, Far and Away is not a hybrid blue-black spell the way that Fire Ice is a hybrid blue-red spell, and you can argue in the comments about whether or not Fire or Ice is individually castable in just a deck that can only cast one or the other. But I think that it's much more castable than any of these sides of any of these fuse cards.
I also have just like one aesthetic quibble is I feel like compared to a split card, like they changed the frame a little bit and added these like little pointy things to make it look different from a split card and added this not necessarily super beautiful fuse keyword across the bottom. What I wish they had also done is just made the art like bleed together into a single frame just to make it look more distinct from a fuse card and kind of reinforce that this can be one spell. And I feel like if they had done that today, they probably would, just because of, sagas and classes. Like, there's so much more.
If they did this today, there'd be like 6 different versions of these, and most of them wouldn't even have the rules text on them.
Sure. But I think there's a lot more precedent for just like changing the frame and changing the art aspect ratio that we probably would have seen that, and that would have been cool. The last thing I think is just crazy is they did print one of these in the Doctor Who set, because all the previous ones were like this one little guild set, and it deals damage to all creatures on the first half, and then it phases creatures out on the second half. And for a second I was like, wait a minute, but that doesn't work because you want to phase your creatures out first. But of course, your creatures don't die from the damage until state-based actions are checked after the spell fully resolves.
So it's like, they should put those in a different order. What the...
But then it can't say Gallifrey Falls no more. The amount of magic rules nuance you have to know to correctly play that card is kind of crazy.
But they really sacrificed the playability because they wanted... I don't know anything about Doctor Who, but presumably they wanted this card to read Gallifrey Falls End No More?
Oh, that's another good point, is they gave up on the and naming convention here, because that doesn't make sense.
Oh, okay. But this absolutely reads like it would kill your creature, even though it does not.
You read it and you're like, I hope this does what I want it to, and it does. But not for the reasons you necessarily know about.
I don't know. I feel like most people are going to read this and think it does not do that, even if they would want it to. Like, I don't know. That's kind of like saying, does this lightning bolt do what I want it to do? What do you want it to do? I want it to deal 4 damage to my opponent. It's like, well, no, it doesn't do that. Like, I think it's written in a very confusing way.
I agree. Any other thoughts on Fuse?
I don't think so. We got one of my favorite modal mechanics, I think, coming up here in Theros.
Okay, well, great, because that answers my first question, which was, do you consider Bestow a modal mechanic?
Yeah. In what world is Bestow not a modal mechanic?
I don't know. Maybe my brain's
so
just mush.
Similar to Bloodrush.
It's similar to Bloodrush. It also feels kind of like Scavenge. I don't know. So let's talk about Bestow.
Yeah, and prepare your defense for how it feels like Scavenge.
I don't know. We've been talking about too many cards.
Go ahead. No. As you're talking about it, prepare your defense. Do both at the same time.
Bestow is an ability that is also on creatures, so in addition to all the normal creature stuff, you can cast it for its Bestow cost, and it becomes an aura spell attached to a creature, and like Bloodrush, it generally, or maybe always, grants that creature's same power and toughness, and sometimes abilities, to that creature. So, like Bloodrush, you kind of have 2 options. Here's my creature I'm going to cast, or here's an aura. I feel like Bestow does a better job in a lot of ways of doing the stuff you would want that kind of like split card nature of it to do. All these are also enchantment creatures, it's worth noting. They become auras, they count as targeting. So for all of the reasons you want to get more auras into a set, you want to get more enchantments, you want to get more ways to target your creature without necessarily just like over-indexing on these cards that are a little bit more narrow. Bestow does pretty much everything you want.
It looks like the original Bestow cards did all have the same symmetrical effect when they were bestowed versus just a creature in play, but they have definitely come back and made newer Bestow creatures that do something else. The most obvious one is Glyph Elemental, which does not give a baseline +2/+2, which is the power and toughness of Glyph Elemental. It just gives the additional power and toughness for the counters on it. But yeah, for the most part, honestly, looking at this and knowing the chronology now, it really seems like they made Heroic in Theros, and then were like, gosh, it would be so sick if Bloodrush worked with Heroic, and we could like come back to Bloodrush. And they were like, well, it doesn't. Let's just make a new mechanic that's like Bloodrush and also fits our Enchantment Matters theme. Like, it almost seems like it tells a story of how this mechanic came to be. Whether it's true or not, I have no idea. But it's so similar to Bloodrush, but it fixes the problem with Heroic, which was in this same set.
It is funny also looking at Bloodrush versus Bestow. Bloodrush is almost always a cheaper cost to Bloodrush, and you get that like cheap combat trick effect stapled to a creature. Bestow, in most cases, is a much more expensive card. So it's either here's my cheap creature or a pretty expensive aura later in the game.
I think every case, right? Because
I'm always wary of like the Revelark exception. There's going to be something, and I know I've got all of them pulled up here, and I can scroll through and I'm going to miss it.
Well, but in this case, it touches on the thing which I like least about Bestow, which is that if you have not played with it before, I think it is unintuitive that if you move to bestow something onto a creature and the target you're bestowing it onto is removed in response, you just get the creature.
Right. So they kind of like saw that there was a little bit too much feels bad. I think your point about having just like a huge density of a certain effect in a set is going to change the way that they think about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that having...
Okay, there is Detective's Phoenix you can bestow by paying only 1 mana but collecting evidence 6. So
there we go. We found the Revelark.
Less mana. We found the Revelark in the set. Sorry. Go ahead.
But no, I think you're right that like maybe if Bestow was just a one-off card, then they wouldn't bother like overhauling the whole rules to say, yeah, this aura, if it would fail to attach to a creature, gets to have this fail case if it still enters the battlefield as a creature. But if you have a whole set where it's like, yeah, I want to cast my 20 different Bestow cards, any instant speed removal is just going to be really good. And in the face of instant speed removal, you just won't want to ever Bestow. So yeah, I think that in the context of this being a mechanic that exists in a certain context in large volume, it makes sense why they did it that way. But it is weird because it's not like a normal aura.
I totally get why it works that way because it makes the mechanic playable, where otherwise it would be so rough, like you said. But it is just, if you are used to playing Magic with regular auras or whatever, this will not work the way you initially anticipate, and you'll have to learn that. Probably my least favorite thing about the mechanic, which otherwise I do actually really like. I think it's a very cool mechanic. I'm a big fan of Glyph Elemental in more powerful cubes and have found places to play some of the less powerful Bestow creatures in other environments. Boon Satyr always been a favorite of both of ours, I think, as a combination combat trick and creature because it has flash, so you can bestow it at instant speed.
Yeah, some of the other more aggressively costed ones I see pretty frequently in cubes where it's just like, yeah, this is your 1 mana 2/1. And also, if you end up kind of flooding out in your aggressive deck, it gives you a little bit more flexibility. And I think that those play pretty well.
It's a really cool way to get more of certain types of effects in your cube that otherwise you wouldn't want to like trim down on creatures for, right? Like, I really like the design of Hypnotic Siren, which is a control magic that also is a 1/1 flyer. And so the control magic gives the thing 1/1 flying, but also it's just a 1/1 flyer. So if you have, a reason to have a cheap creature in play to put equipment on it, or because you have an Edric in your deck or whatever, it's just perfectly playable on the front side. So you get to put these two kinds of things in your cube in one card, which is so often what we talk about as the benefit of these modal cards from a cube design perspective. If you want another control magic, but you don't want to give up a slot that, would otherwise go to a cheap creature, now you can have both with a card like Hypnotic Siren.
Yeah, and I love that exception, and I feel like we've been seeing this a bunch where it's like, yeah, most of these things, you put it on your creature, makes it bigger, but what else is an aura? Control magic is an aura, so we can have this like very, very differently playing card using the same mechanic is kind of fun.
Though it does still do the same thing. It still gives it additional +1/+1 and flying as the original creature's a 1/1 flyer. So it's like, it does both. It's both the elegant sort of simplicity of symmetry there and also radical recontextualization.
And this is a mechanic that we have seen come back a couple times, and I would not be surprised because it just has so much flexibility. Like, this is a mechanic that has lots of knobs because they didn't bake the mana cost into the actual ability. Like, they can change that cost however they need for whatever the context is. And also, even though they are generally giving like the same power and toughness boost, which makes the cards easier to read and play with and understand, like with that one exception, they have the opportunity to break that mold.
Apparently also Trickster's Elk. 3 mana to cast, 2 mana to bestow.
There you go. Why did they do that? I guess
that's probably some...
it loses all power. So this is also one that you can use in a defensive sense. If your opponent has a Gristlebrand, you can say, you actually have an Elk. Actually, I kind of like this card.
It is kind of interesting. I could see this for like a regular cube style thing. And yeah, the bestow cost being cheaper means that here, just for a 3/3, it would never be worth like targeting your creature with a bestow and then like sacrificing your creature immediately to like just get the 3/3.
I mean, that's an interesting point. You can do that. I feel like the best case of Trickster's Elk is like if you have a bunch of creatures made of +1/+1 counters, because this also sets the base toughness. It doesn't add toughness and power. Mm-hmm. You can end up sort of cheating a bigger creature with a bestow, and then you do have that fallback of when that creature dies, you also get that. I think we forgot to say that. If the creature dies, the bestowed creature also then remains a creature on the battlefield. So there's like potential for Trickster's Elk to actually do a whole bunch in the right context, and has that fallback case of like, oh, my opponent opponent has a huge creature that has a relevant static ability or activated ability, just turn it into an elk.
And then when you trade with that elk in combat, now you
get
an elk.
the elk. Is this card just good?
Anthony's in love with Trickster's elk.
I just like, what's that enchantment that does the same thing of turns the thing into an elk, but then it's never quite, it's called like Kenrith. Shut up, you're
Return.
An elk. Is that what it's
I
called?
think it's called Kenrith's Return.
We're going to find out.
It's called like Kenrith, shut up, you're an elk.
I'm pretty sure that's it. Kenrith's transformation. That makes a lot more sense than Return.
Yeah, that does make a lot more sense. Tell me how Bestow is like Scavenge?
They're both mechanics in the game Magic the Gathering.
Just to be totally clear, I consider this a modal mechanic because there are two different ways you can cast the card in two completely different modalities.
The fact that you also, if the creature dies, you get your Bestow card means you're always getting the baseline of, I might have this creature at some point, but I also, for now, in the present, until such a future, have a bonus. It's actually exactly reverse Scavenge. It's just Scavenge.
I think
if
the order
just
matters,
think about
though.
time differently.
I think the order matters. Like, to me, that's what I was saying about, like, if you're always doing something in like a prescribed order, it does not feel modal to me. It just feels like a card that does multiple things. And if you get a choice up front, like when you first put the card into play or into a zone where it matters, if every Scavenge card also had cycling, now it's a modal mechanic for sure. Well, I mean, cycling's a modal mechanic already, so, but you know what I mean. If every card just had, like, you know, discard this card for no effect, but you could discard any Scavenge card for free, then yeah, sure, now it's a modal mechanic.
It just has channel, 0, :
Now you're designing Modern Horizons cards. On the Scavenge tip, you're also going to have to sell me on Monstrosity being a modal mechanic.
Well, I think we've perfectly summed up why it's not really, because it's always
This one
just,
is a lot like Scavenge.
you do the creature, and then later on in the game, you got some more mana, you do it again. There's going to be some Revel Arcs in here. There's something that's got Monstrosity with a...
Monstrosity negative time? Like
Negative Monstrosity?
You can Monstrosity it before you cast it?
Some monstrous cards are small. Some monsters are small. Yeah, I think I agree. Like, there's maybe that kind of like cycling modality where a lot of things will have an extra effect tacked onto the monstrous ability, where it's like, when this becomes monstrous, fight something or deal some damage. I guess we should say, even if we are dismissing this as a modal mechanic, Monstrosity is an ability on creatures that for some cost, you put some number of +1/+1 counters on the creature. You can only do that one time, and sometimes other effects happen.
What's the Monstrosity they returned to?
Adapt,
thank you. Where it made so much more sense. Because Monstrosity, you just had to remember if that creature had ever become monstrous, if something removed its counters or, you know, changed its state, it still had become monstrous and you couldn't do it again. And Adapt, I think, is much cleaner in that it just says, do this only if it has no +1/+1 counters on it.
Yeah, which is funny because it kind of cuts two ways. If you put a counter on it some other way, then you can't use the adaptability because it's like, well, this is already some kind of mutated. But it also means you have the option that if you have some way to remove the counters, you can re-adapt it. And in some cases, there was like a triggered ability, or not a triggered ability, but an ability bound to the adaptation, which meant you could kind of create these loops, which is kind of cool.
I think it's a triggered ability. You can activate ability that causes a delayed trigger or a trigger.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in a lot of cases, probably it is.
I'm thinking specifically of the guy, the 2-drop, that can go get more copies of itself and turn into a 4-drop.
I had one of those in my sideboard this weekend.
We're not even close to talking about this mechanic, so, you know, you can talk about that one in the comments, but I think we should skip Monstrosity, and, you know, you might also have to make the case to me about Will of the Council. Let's talk about that one.
Okay, this is also one that just is weird, which is why I wanted to talk about it. Will of the Council is a pretty weird mechanic. This is from one of the conspiracy sets, and starting with you, I'm just going to read Council's Judgment as an example. Starting with you, each player votes for a non-land permanent you don't control, exile each permanent with the most votes or tied for the most votes. Or maybe even a better example is Coercive Portal, where there are two different outcomes. The beginning of upkeep, either everybody's going to draw cards, you're going to draw cards, or you're going to destroy everything. In 2-player Magic, these end up being weird because the way that they are phrased, you do end up basically just like getting to make the choice because you're like, well, we're tied for the most votes because I have rigged it that way. I get to choose between, are we going to destroy everything or am I going to draw cards?
No, you don't.
Is that not true?
That's not true.
How is that not true?
It says if Carnage gets more votes, you can't control whether Carnage gets more votes because your opponent could always vote Carnage as well. And so you don't get Carnage ever. You can always draw a card, unless you choose to vote Carnage, which is just throwing away your vote and throwing away the effect of your card, unless you think your opponent is also going to vote Carnage and you're going to disagree about whether or not you want to destroy everything.
Okay, so what we're saying is this mechanic is just confusing and we shouldn't talk about because it's so confusing.
I don't think it's a modal mechanic. I do think it's a really confusing mechanic in 1v1 Magic, and you described the two cards I've ever seen play in one-on-one cubes, both Council's Judgment and Coercive Portal, and people just play them in spite of the will of the Council, not because of will of the Council, right? Like, Coercive Portal is just a 4-mana Phyrexian Altar, Phyrexian Arena that just draws you another card every upkeep in any color, which in like Vintage Cube, historically, back in the day, was quite good because you had ways to like ramp out colorless things. I mean, you start drawing more cards. And Council's Judgment, again, I think his card is aged pretty poorly on power level, but was a 3-mana sorcery to exile anything that was non-land, which mattered.
Right, because voting for a thing didn't count as targeting a thing, so you could get rid of True Name Nemesis with this in particular.
Things, get rid of things with protection, whatever. But I do think it brings up an important point. Well, an important point. None of this is important.
Nothing.
It brings up a point that I'm interested in making, which is that, once again, in the like cards that do multiple things are not inherently modal space, I think if the choice is being given to your opponent, that is not a modal card. That is a card where you have one choice, which is cast it or not, and your opponent has choices to make around what else happens, right? So, like, Council's Judgment is modal in the sense that sometimes it exiles one thing you want to exile, and sometimes it exiles two things if your opponent is very dumb, right? Like, that's a possibility. And again, Coercive Portal, if you and your opponent both think that you are better off if everything is destroyed, then one of you is wrong, just deterministically. But if you both think that, then yes, that card can do a second thing. But, I think of like Vexing Devil as a card that like can do two things. It can either do 4 damage to your opponent, or it can make a 1-mana 4/4. That's not a modal card though, because you're giving your opponent the choices. You're not actually getting any choices from it. To me, at least.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just think about the time, just to like drag on Will of the Council has a bad mechanic, at least in 2-player Magic. Remember the story of somebody going to a Legacy tournament when this card first came out, casting it, and their opponent being like, what the heck is that? Like, you can do, how does this work? And they like stopped, read the card again, stepped aside, talked to a judge, said, okay, that resolves. And they pointed at a card, and their opponent pointed at a different card. It's like, you spent so much time trying to understand what this card did, and you did it wrong. Very, very wrong.
Yeah, terrible mechanic. Truly awful. I guess one last point on this, just to like say it, I don't care about like pedantically defining modal cards for like
Don't you,
fun.
though?
I truly don't. Here's what I'm saying. I like modal cards as a tool for a cube designer, and I think it is worth defining what I mean when I say I like this class of thing. I do not include Vexing Devil in that class of thing, or Will of the Council cards in that class of thing, because it does not do the thing that modal cards so often do in cube design, which is allow you to get multiple different kinds of effects into limited slots in a cube or in a cube deck. Punisher cards are like, cards that give your opponent a decision. Sure, the card can do multiple things, but it's not modal. You have no autonomy over those modes. It's just a thing that's going to happen to you. You have one choice, which is put it on the stack or not.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Let's move past it.
On to sieges. One of the few permanent-based modal mechanics. So oftentimes, modal mechanics are like, it's like complicated to have a game piece in play that could like have multiple different states that's otherwise not indicated. So we very often see modal mechanics on spells or like on things that only have like their different modes from different zones, like reinforce. Once you've put a card in play, you can no longer reinforce it. And so it kind of loses its modality. And the sieges are an example of just a permanent that just has multiple modes.
Yeah, it's funny. It's sort of just like, so these are all enchantments that when they enter the battlefield, you choose one mode or the other, and then I think it's it's not only upkeep triggers. Yeah, the enchantment just does one or the other thing. Often it is a thing that triggers every turn at the upkeep. I think that there are a lot of cards that are like this, but these feel like a mechanic. It's not like Outlaw's Merriment, which is, well, that's a bad example because that one's random. Like, there are some enchantments that will trigger and give you a choice, but these feel like a cohesive, like, actual mechanic.
I mean, I guess we should say, like, it's not a named mechanic, but it's kind of like the commands in that it follows, like, a rigid template and convention that we see return to, at least, I mean, they returned to it recently, and they returned to the Khan's plane. And it was originally in Dragons of Tarkir or Fate Reforged?
Fate Reforged, I'm pretty sure, yeah. So what do you think about this? Because we talked a little bit about Planeswalkers and how, yeah, they are, in a sense, modal mechanics, but they don't have the same sort of gameplay role. Like, players aren't putting it in their deck because they think, oh, I want this card because it has some flexibility. They have put it in your deck because it's going to take over the game if it sticks around for a number of turns. And another question is like the split between how often are you choosing one mode or another. Often the sieges, the modes are pretty different, and I feel like you're just putting it in your deck because you want it to do the one thing, and maybe occasionally the other thing comes up. I don't know. So like they are very explicitly modal, but they also, in the same sense as Planeswalkers, feel kind of less modal in that sense you were trying to describe of like giving players more choices and agency.
I think the thing about the cards like the Sieges is I think it's really hard to have both modes be, on average, exactly equally appealing.
Definitely.
And I honestly have not played with any of these enough to give you like a concrete example. But like, just looking at Citadel Siege, you can either at the beginning of combat on your turn put 2+1/+1 counters to target creature you control, or at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, tap a creature that player controls. And to me, Khans seems quite a bit better than Dragons there. Now, it's not to say there's not a situation where like, oh, I have no answer for your big flyer, and so my Citadel Siege becomes a very expensive, pacifism basically for your big flyer. But, that's 4 mana for a pretty bad pacifism compared to Khans, which is like, snowballing sort of makes any threat pretty big pretty quick. So I think the danger is that they're, again, explicitly modal, but the chances that you've designed a cube environment where each mode is, on average, equally appealing is kind of hard. I do think it's possible that in a given deck, they will 95% of the time choose one mode. But in theory, you could have different decks that really cared about different things that might care about one mode or the other. Like, let's take Citadel Siege again. Was it Eldraine? Yeah, was Eldraine where they returned to like tapping matters, where like when you tapped a thing of an opponent's, you like got some upside? There was a few cards printed with that sort of text. I could imagine a cube where maybe you have a bunch of those cards, maybe Broken Singleton for the more appealing ones, and then Citadel Siege in a deck with all the things that care about tapping your opponent's stuff. All of a sudden it's like, okay, now this is not just, every time I tap an opponent's thing, it becomes, a part of a synergistic engine. And then you can imagine that card is kind of actually modal, but it's modal at a higher level. It's like modal as far as the cube is concerned, but once it's in a deck, it's going to kind of do one thing or the other, which I think is a big part of the value of modal cards. Like, if you can put a payoff for 2 different decks in your cube in one card, that's, I think, on average, a very cool thing to be able to do that affords you a lot of flexibility as a cube designer and lets you get more support for both decks in there and be very efficient with your use of cards. So, yeah, without being able to speak to any of these individual designs, the only one I've ever actually played in any context before is Outpost Siege, because I think it has the pretty unique text of whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, is 1 damage target creature or player. That exact sort of trigger, I'm not sure how many other cards have that. I don't think it's very many. I say this as the designer of the 100 Ornithopters Cube, where I was looking for such effects, and I believe this was one of the only ones I came across. It's unique in that sense, that it has a weird sort of leaves the battlefield thing, which might be useful in certain archetypes.
The other one that I see occasionally is Monastery Siege, because one of the abilities is at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card, and then discard a card. So many people put this into a cube where they've got a madness theme or some other like thing that cares about drawing and discarding. And yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good example that kind of highlights the difference, because if you had this on just an instant that said either draw discard or the other mode is spells your opponents cast that target your creatures cost an additional 2, you might put that in your deck that just cares about discarding cards, but then every once in a while your opponent's going to cast a removal spell and you'll say, cool, I'll counter that with this tax. Because that's like a one-time effect. Like, you get enough value out of that one-time effect that it feels very modal, but I feel like if I'm putting this in my deck that just cares about the discard, I'm not going to say like, okay, well, I'm going to sacrifice doing this for the next 6 turns in order to get this one value in this individual moment. Like, that doesn't feel the same to me anymore. So I think your point about how it still might give more flexibility in the draft because different players might want it for different reasons, but they don't feel modal during gameplay in the same way. Unless, obviously there are specific examples where the modes are narrow enough or like equal enough in value that sure they might come up, but a lot of these cards are really kind of like build aroundy.
Just to head off the pedantic comments, the thing you described would not counter and a spell on the stack because it just makes the thing cost more.
Okay, look, I'm looking at the one example.
I know. I'm not saying it to criticize you. I'm just saying because somebody out there was getting ready to be a keyboard warrior.
It would be reworded if it was on an instant such that it would make
countered
sense.
Unless it's paid. Yeah. Unless you pay 2 or whatever. Sure.
But you're right.
And also, just to clarify my point about Planeswalkers, because I do think that, the average Planeswalker is probably more modal than these cards, because it probably does different things on different turns, right? There's probably very few planeswalkers, save for the ones that only downtick, where you're using the exact same, loyalty ability every single turn. And once these are in play, they're going to do the same thing every turn. You can't change your decision on a future turn. My point about planeswalkers is just that if you are trying to get more modal effects in your cube, and the way you go about that is adding a bunch of planeswalkers, there will be a bunch of knock-on effects to the cube environment that have nothing to do with modality that will overshadow the fact that you've added modality to your cube, if that makes sense. So it's not that planeswalkers aren't modal. They are. It's just that they're also a bunch of other stuff. And that other stuff is probably going to loom larger in how your cube feels than the additional modality.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's worth considering.
I think we should call it there because the next couple of mechanics are from the same set. I don't want to split a set across episodes, so I think we'll call this the end of Modal Mechanics Part 3. Do you have any closing thoughts in general about modality and cube? Is this sort of tour through history changing your perspective of what modal cards you do or don't want to include in your own cube lists?
I think more, like I said before, it's just sort of making me rethink the types of mechanics that exist, and I think it'll be interesting if we want to go back and sort of reframe other kinds of effects. And I don't know if it's going to make me a better designer, but it's just fun to look at old Magic cards.
It's not going to make you a worse designer.
Unless you're just focusing on the wrong thing.
You could get too deep, too lost in the sauce. It is possible.
Multiple options exist. It's so hard to say which one we'll choose.
And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Happy New Year to all of our gorgeous, beautiful listeners out there. Couple little quick reminders here. We are still planning to record the book club episode about the design of everyday things. So if you want to know what we're talking about when we record that episode, you should read that book or pick it up as a ebook or something.
How are you enjoying that book?
I'm reading the book. Reading is hard for me. I don't enjoy it.
I'm sorry. We don't have to do the book club if you don't like it.
I like to be challenged to do different things. The problem is I really struggle to get through a thing when I'm not enraptured by it. I can read when I really love a book. The problem is I don't know if I'm really going to love a book until I'm halfway through or whatever. And then anyway.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's not a book that is explicitly about game design. And I will say that I have some criticisms, but I think that there's also a lot that is both interesting to people that are thinking about game design and also just interested in the way stuff around them works, which I think applies to many cube designers. So, definitely you don't have to read it. You can just tune into our conversation in the future when that happens. But if you want to follow along more closely, pick it up.
And a couple of friendly reminders that we don't do every episode. We do have a P.O. Box. If you want to send us some physical mail, P.O. Box 4855, Baltimore, Maryland, 21211. That's the best way to get any message on the show and to make sure we read it, because digital methods of getting in contact with us are oftentimes flooded and we don't pay attention to all the things, and we're very sorry. Also, I haven't said this in probably, a year, but go leave us a positive review on Spotify or on iTunes or wherever you're listening to the show. If you don't want to contribute to the Patreon or whatever, but you want to give back in some way, it does really help. And it also helps us bury dumb comments that the occasional person leaves where somebody's like, I didn't listen to this show for a whole year. Then I went and listened to one episode and made some assessment about all the episodes I didn't hear and what I think they contained. And I'm not salty about it at all. I really don't like when I can't respond to comments. iTunes reviews you can't respond to. There's no way to reach those people. And just
There's one way to reach them.
This person's explicitly not listening to this episode. They said they were stopping listening. So
they might be lying.
if you're lying, that's a dumb review, and you should feel bad for leaving it. Anyway. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and if we got any of the rules text of any of those Magic cards wrong, that was completely on purpose to bait engagement. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for making me think harder about Trickster Elk. Do you think that's too good for regular Cube?
No, it's definitely not too good.
It does a lot of what makes sense there.
It's definitely not too good.
Okay, great.
I think it would be a cool inclusion, and would be interesting to see how people use it.
Interesting to see a single card update to the regular cube.
And it's Trickster Elk. After no updates for 14 months, you're like, what about one Trickster Elk?
One little Trickster Elk as a treat.
That's honestly very funny. I love that a lot. It's nowhere near as good as Bannerhide Cruciak, so I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah, 3
I
mana,
know
3,
it doesn't
3
have Bestow, but, Bannerhide Cruciak is also a Modern Horizons revisiting of a other modal mechanic from the same era, and I think Bannerhide Cruciak is pound for pound more powerful. They're also both... Bannerhide Cruciak was a common or an uncommon in Modern Horizons?
Couldn't say.
Yeah, it's impossible to know. Unknowable.